March 15, 1910, Hartford, Connecticut. The factory floor at Colt's Manufacturing Company hummed with a low, mechanical heartbeat. Oil hung in the air like the scent of progress. A single light swung above a workbench littered with steel fragments, the skeleton of a new weapon waiting to breathe. John Moses Browning leaned over the table, sleeves rolled, eyes fixed on the geometry of war. He had built dozens of weapons before, but this one felt different. This one would change everything. In the early years of the 20th century, America was changing, its industries rising, its soldiers scattered across distant islands and jungles. The age of the revolver, once a symbol of frontier grit, was fading. The future belonged to machines, to weapons that could think faster than the man who held them. The U.S. Army wanted a pistol that could stop an enemy in one shot, in any condition, under any sky. Their officers had seen too much failure. In the Philippine jungles, Moro warriors had charged through clouds of smoke and bullets, their bodies refusing to fall. The standard issue .38 revolvers had proved too weak, their rounds too light. Soldiers fired until their cylinders ran dry, and still the enemy kept coming. It was more than a tactical failure, it was a psychological one. And in the quiet halls of the War Department, men began to ask hard questions about power, precision, and faith in steel. That is when they turned to Browning. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even an engineer by formal training. He was a blacksmith's son from Ogden, Utah, a man who could read the soul of metal as others read scripture. He believed that every problem in design had a moral answer, that the simplest solution was often the most honest. By 1910, Browning had already created machine guns and rifles that defined modern firepower. Yet this project, the Army's search for a new sidearm, became deeply personal. He understood what soldiers faced. He had listened to their stories, the trembling hands, the fogged breath of battle, the quiet seconds after a trigger pull when life and death balanced on the weight of a bullet. His first prototypes were rough, heavy, and loud, but they worked. Each time the slide recoiled, each time the cartridge ejected cleanly, Browning felt something ancient stir in him, the timeless pursuit of reliability in chaos. To him, a gun was not about killing, it was about trust. A soldier could not question his weapon. He could not wonder if it would fire. He had to know. And so, he designed a pistol that embodied that faith. 7 rounds of .45 caliber power, each one guided by a mechanism of ruthless simplicity. It was made not for show, but for survival, an instrument meant to endure mud, rain, blood, and time itself. When the U.S. Army announced open trials for a new service pistol, manufacturers from across the world answered the call. Germany sent the Luger. Savage Arms sent their compact, elegant .45 prototype. Colt, carrying Browning's design, entered quietly, a simple slab-sided pistol that lacked the foreign flair of its rivals. The tests began at Springfield Armory. For 6 weeks, soldiers fired round after round, tens of thousands in total. Barrels heated, springs broke, slides jammed. Except one, Browning's pistol kept firing, through grit and dust, through the relentless rhythm of testing, it never quit. Observers noted how the gun seemed to breathe with each shot, how it kicked hard but returned to ready like a living thing. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some officers called it too heavy, too industrial. They said its recoil was violent, its frame too thick for comfort. But a few, the ones who had seen real combat, understood. They saw in that weapon something beyond steel, the promise of certainty. When the trial ended, the official report was brief, almost clinical. The Colt automatic pistol has passed the tests. No ceremony, no speeches, just the quiet recognition of a design that had survived everything thrown at it. On March 29, 1911, the U.S. Army officially adopted Browning's pistol as its new standard sidearm. It would be called the Model 1911. Outside the walls of Springfield Armory, the world went on. Horses on cobblestone streets, telegraphs humming, factories rising. Few noticed the announcement. Few understood that history had just shifted, quietly and forever. For John Browning, it was both victory and farewell. He returned to his workshop, already dreaming of the next design. He didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He simply nodded to the pistol on his table, as if acknowledging an old friend who would soon go to war. In the coming decades, millions would hold that same shape of steel. Young men barely out of school, officers burdened with command, gunners whose hands shook after long nights under fire. The 1911 would speak for them all. It would bark in the trenches of France, echo in the jungles of the Pacific, and rest heavy in the hands of soldiers who prayed to make it home. But in 1911, all of that was still a whisper of the future. For now, the pistol sat in its crate, stamped U.S. property, ready to be shipped to the armories of a nation not yet at war. Some inventions are born in noise, others in silence. The Model 1911 was born in both, the hum of machinery, the clang of hammers, and the stillness of a man who understood what war demanded from those who survived it. And somewhere in that silence, the world began to change, one pull of a trigger at a time. April 6, 1917, Washington, D.C. Outside the Capitol, the air was sharp with spring rain and the low murmur of crowds. Inside, President Woodrow Wilson signed a document that would send America across the ocean into a war the world called Great. On the benches of armories across the country, the Model 1911 lay waiting, its blued steel reflecting the lamplight of destiny. In a few months, it would be tested not by engineers, but by war itself. When the United States entered the First World War, it stepped into an inferno already burning for 3 years. Europe was a graveyard of trenches, a world of mud, wire, and gas where courage was measured in inches. For the young men of America, it was a new kind of war, fought with machines their fathers could scarcely imagine. And among those machines was the sidearm that John Browning had built in silence only 6 years earlier. At first, few soldiers noticed it. The rifle was king on the Western Front, the Springfield, the Enfield, the Mauser. But the pistol had its own kingdom, the trenches, the tunnels, the dark spaces between explosions where a man could see the whites of another's eyes. There, the 1911 found its purpose. Reports from France began to filter back. Men wrote home about the kick of the .45, about how it punched through helmets, shattered wooden beams, and dropped charging enemies in their tracks. A corporal from the 82nd Division wrote in his diary, "It jumps in your hand like it's alive, but it speaks true, every time." The Army Ordnance Department had worried that its recoil would be too strong for ordinary soldiers. But soldiers didn't complain. They called it a reliable friend, a piece of home, machined and blued. When rifles jammed in mud, when bayonets bent and grenades failed, the 1911 still fired. And when men faced the terror of hand-to-hand combat, they learned the comfort of its single, heavy shot. Browning's pistol became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of steadiness in a world gone mad, the quiet pulse of American industry beating inside a storm of chaos. Yet behind every success was strain. Factories back home in Hartford, Bridgeport, and Hartford's sister city of Springfield were working around the clock. Steel was rationed, labor was scarce. Women joined the lines, their hands dark with oil and carbon, shaping parts they knew would cross the ocean to sons and brothers. Each slide stamped United States property was a promise, one forged in smoke and sacrifice. By late 1918, more than 400,000 Model 1911 pistols had been delivered to the U.S. Army. They arrived by crate, by ship, by rail, each weapon cleaned, checked, and numbered. The logistics were staggering. The precision required was absolute. Every screw, every spring had to fit perfectly, whether assembled in Connecticut or field-stripped in a trench a continent away. That was the genius of Browning's design. It could be taken apart with no tools, repaired in the mud, and kept running in the worst conditions imaginable. In France, it earned nicknames: the Equalizer, the Trench Sweeper, the 45. Men trusted it with their lives and sometimes with their deaths. In the Meuse-Argonne offensive, in the final days of the war, American forces fought through forests thick with smoke and wire. Officers carried their 1911s drawn, shouting orders above the roar of machine guns. When German soldiers broke through, the pistol became the last line of defense, fast, brutal, unflinching. There were moments, brief, terrible, human moments, when its purpose became clear. A wounded private, too weak to shoulder his rifle. A trench flooded in the night, men waist-deep in freezing water, the sound of footsteps in the dark. In those seconds, the 1911 was the difference between living and being buried nameless in foreign soil. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, and the guns fell silent, the world exhaled. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. But one thing had survived untouched: the reputation of a pistol that never failed. Back in the United States, Colt's machines slowed. The workers cleaned their benches. John Browning moved on to new projects, rifles, machine guns, other challenges. But in the minds of the soldiers who returned home, one memory stayed: the cold steel in their palm, the sure click of the safety, the certainty that, for all the madness of war, this one thing had never betrayed them. The Model 1911 had crossed its first battlefield and returned victorious. But history has a way of testing the things we love. In the years ahead, as the world changed again, as new wars rose from the ashes of old, this weapon would face questions it was never designed to answer. Was it a tool of protection or a symbol of power? A piece of genius or a relic of a simpler age? Those questions would wait. For now, the pistol rested in its holster, the war's dust still clinging to its grip. The soldiers carried it home like a piece of memory, heavy, reliable, unshakable. They believed the Great War had ended all wars, but history, like a loaded chamber, was waiting for the next round. And in the silence between battles, the Model 1911 waited with it. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun glinted on calm water and anchored ships. Then, the sky tore open. Engines screamed, bombs fell, and steel burned. As the smoke rose over Battleship Row, a nation woke to war. In the chaos, some men reached not for rifles, but for a pistol, a weapon that had served their fathers in France. The Model 1911 was back in their hands, and history was calling again. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, America's factories came alive overnight. Production lines that had sat quiet since the Great War began to hum with a furious rhythm. Steel, oil, and human will, the raw ingredients of modern war, fused into motion. Among the first tools pulled from storage was John Browning's pistol. The same design, the same soul. Only now, the world had grown far more dangerous. The Army and Navy reissued their stockpiles. Colt resumed production, joined by new contractors, Remington Rand, Ithaca, Union Switch, and Signal, and even Singer, a sewing machine company turned arms maker. Each factory followed the same blueprints, each weapon built to the same unwavering tolerances. The result was unity, millions of pistols, all identical, all reliable. By 1942, the Model 1911 was everywhere, in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Guadalcanal, the frozen fields of Bastogne. Officers, paratroopers, tank crews, engineers all carried the same cold weight on their belts. It became more than a sidearm. It was a piece of trust shared across oceans. In the Pacific, where humidity ruined rifles and rain turned camps to swamps, the 1911 thrived. Its 45 caliber rounds tore through the dense foliage, cutting short the deadly close-quarters charges of Japanese infantry. In the dark tunnels of Iwo Jima, Marines crawled through blackness, fingers tight on the trigger. The 1911's short barrel, its stopping power, its refusal to jam. All of it meant survival in a world where every second counted. A Marine named Corporal Hayes wrote home after the battle, "The pistol kicks like a mule, but it does what it's told. I don't clean it half as much as I should, but it keeps firing." Maybe Browning built it for the devil himself. In Europe, it was a different war. Colder, heavier, fought in ruined cities and hedgerows. Tank crews carried the pistol as their last defense if their armor burned. Paratroopers dropped into Normandy with it strapped to their chest, a promise of hope if everything else failed. And when the fog of war closed in, when visibility vanished and orders fell apart, the 1911 spoke with absolute clarity. Back home, America's war effort became a miracle of industry. Women filled the machine shops, assembling slides and frames, measuring tolerances with the precision of surgeons. Each pistol was tested by hand. Each round fired into oiled paper targets, inspected by eyes that knew the cost of failure. They worked long hours in silence, their minds on the sons and husbands across the sea. In the language of machines, their hands said, "Come home alive." The gun's design had not changed, but war had. Combat was faster now, more mechanical. The pistol that had once been the last resort of trench officers now became the sidearm of tank commanders, bomber crews, and paratroopers. And still, through every change, the 1911 held its place. Proof that simplicity could outlast revolution. In 1944, a sergeant from the 101st Airborne wrote after Bastogne, "When the ammo ran out and the cold bit our fingers, we kept one thing close, that old Colt. It didn't need warmth or luck. Just a steady hand." The war revealed something profound about the weapon. It wasn't perfect. Its magazine held only 7 rounds. Its recoil was fierce, its weight exhausting on long marches. But it was honest. When you pulled the trigger, it delivered exactly what it promised. In a world of deception and chaos, that kind of certainty became a lifeline. By 1945, as the atomic age dawned, the 1911 had earned a legend status few weapons ever achieve. It had crossed oceans and decades without needing to evolve. While nations experimented with automatics, submachine guns, and carbines, the 1911 remained untouched, a relic that refused to become obsolete. When victory came and soldiers began to return home, many carried their 1911s back as keepsakes, tokens of survival. Some kept them in drawers, wrapped in oiled cloth. Some passed them down to sons who would one day serve in Korea, then in Vietnam. Others could never look at them again. The sound of it slide too closely tied to memories they wished to forget. In war, tools become symbols, and the Model 1911 had become a symbol of endurance. The idea that something built with honesty could survive the world's worst madness. John Browning had died long before this war began. He never saw what his pistol became, never knew that his work would span generations. But in every corner of every battlefield, from the decks of carriers to the snows of the Ardennes, his design spoke for him, a language of precision, a vocabulary of trust. When peace finally came, the world was scarred, rebuilt, reborn. but the weapon remained. In the new American century, the 1911 would serve again, not because it was perfect, but because it was right in a world of fire and blood. It stood unshaken, a piece of human will forged in steel. April the 25th, 1951. Korea, the Imjin River. Cold rain drifted across the valley. American soldiers crouched in foxholes, their rifles caked in mud, their breath pale in the dim light of dawn. Among them, a sergeant gripped his pistol, the same Colt his father had carried through France in 1918. He checked the chamber once more and whispered, "You've never failed me yet." Moments later, the hills erupted in fire, and the Model 1911 was asked to prove itself once again. When World War II ended, it seemed nothing could dethrone Browning's creation. It had served on every front, carried by millions, trusted beyond question. But peace has a way of changing priorities. New wars were fought in laboratories and boardrooms, wars of design, doctrine, and ideology. The Model 1911, heavy and simple, was now an old soldier in a world racing toward modernity. By the early 1950s, the United States was once again at war, this time in the frozen hills of Korea. The conflict was brutal and unforgiving, fought in temperatures that froze steel solid and turned oil to ice. Here, the 1911 proved its age and its resilience all at once. Its single-action trigger was precise, its heavy frame still reliable. But soldiers began to whisper about its flaws: limited magazine capacity, slow reloads, stiff recoil. In an age of automatic rifles and mechanized warfare, the pistol felt like a relic. Still, it endured. In trench outposts and frozen bunkers, it was the same story. When rifles jammed, when mortars silenced everything else, the 1911 remained. An officer in the 7th Infantry Division later recalled, "That old Colt wasn't fast, but it was final." Behind the front lines, the Ordnance Department began to discuss replacements. The military world was evolving: lighter materials, higher capacity magazines, new calibers like 9mm, European designs, Walther, Beretta, Sig, were changing how armies thought about handguns. America faced a question it had not asked in decades. Had Browning's masterpiece reached its end? The Cold War intensified that question. As jets replaced propellers and missiles replaced artillery, the M1911 seemed to belong to another century. But the Army couldn't let go easily. The pistol had proven itself in every storm. To abandon it felt like abandoning a piece of history, or perhaps a part of the nation's own soul. By the time Vietnam arrived, that soul was tested again. The 1911 returned to war, this time in the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia. The soldiers who carried it were young, their fathers' stories distant echoes. But the pistol in their hand was the same, its slide still stamped U.S. property. In the dense foliage of the Mekong Delta, it earned new scars. Its steel frame rusted in the humidity, its blued finish dulled to gray, but still it fired. It fired when nothing else would. Special Forces operators, tunnel rats, and helicopter crews all relied on it when the world closed in. They called it the hand cannon, half in awe, half in fear. There were moments when its power was both savior and curse. A tunnel rat once described it bluntly: "Down there it's too much gun, but I'd rather have too much than not enough." By the war's end, America itself had changed, its confidence shaken, its soldiers weary. And the Model 1911, though still faithful, began to look old beside sleek new weapons from Europe. The Pentagon wanted standardization with NATO. the 9mm parabellum round, the same used by Allies. It was practical, logical, but logic rarely understands loyalty. In 1985, after 74 years of service, the U.S. military made it official. The Model 1911 would be replaced by the Beretta M9, lighter, higher capacity, easier to train with. A new generation for a new era. The old pistol was phased out, stored in armories, sold as surplus, or retired to glass cases. For many veterans, it felt like the end of an era, not just of a weapon, but of a relationship. Gun racks stood empty where the 1911 had once hung. Instructors trained recruits on new pistols, plastic and foreign, and somewhere, in quiet workshops across the country, old gunsmiths wiped their hands and shook their heads. They knew what the world was gaining and what it was losing. Because a weapon like the 1911 was more than steel, it carried the fingerprints of generations, the echo of battles that shaped the century. It was the weight of history balanced perfectly in the palm of a hand. John Browning had never designed it for fame. He designed it for survival. And survival, he might have said, is not always about being new. It's about being right. As the world moved on to alloys and polymers, his century-old design lingered in the shadows, still firing, still trusted, still speaking in the calm authority of precision. But in the age of satellites and silicon, there was no place for sentiment. The 1911 was a veteran with nowhere left to fight. Its story might have ended there, in the silence of armories and collectors' safes. And yet, history rarely leaves perfection behind forever. Every generation forgets, until the next war reminds them why some things were built the way they were. November 11, 1989, Arlington National Cemetery. Leaves drifted across the white stones. An old man in uniform stood alone before a grave, his hands trembling as he held a pistol wrapped in a cloth. He didn't speak. He just placed it down, the blued steel catching a final glint of sun. The Model 1911 had survived 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam. Now, it had nothing left to fight but time itself. The Cold War ended quietly, not with the roar of artillery, but with the sigh of history closing another chapter. In that silence, the Model 1911 seemed to fade away, replaced by newer designs, lighter frames, and polymer dreams. But in workshops, gun safes, and the minds of veterans, it lived on. To those who had carried it, the 1911 was more than a weapon. It was memory made tangible, the sound, the smell, the weight of a time they could never fully leave behind. They remembered the recoil in their wrist, the soft clack of the slide, the warmth of the steel after a firefight. Those sensations stayed long after the noise of war had gone. Collectors began to search for them, the original Colts, the Remington Rands, the Singer models built in small wartime batches. Each carried a story. Some bore the initials of a soldier scratched beneath the grip. Others still had sand from Iwo Jima or traces of jungle corrosion from Vietnam. Every pistol was a relic of a century that had fought too many battles. In the quiet suburbs of America, men who had once been boys in uniform gathered at ranges on weekends. They brought their 1911s, cleaned, oiled, and worn smooth from use. They would fire a few slow rounds, the sound echoing off concrete walls like distant thunder. Then they would talk, not about politics, not about glory, but about friends, the ones who hadn't come home. One veteran from the 25th Infantry once said, "When I fire it, it's not nostalgia, it's respect. That gun never failed me. I owe it that much." But the world outside moved on. New soldiers were handed Berettas and SIGs, learning drills from instructors who had never touched a 1911. The old pistols gathered dust in armories, their serial numbers fading under decades of neglect, and yet they refused to disappear. Law enforcement agencies kept them, Special units, distrustful of new designs, quietly reissued them for covert work. In 1991, fittingly 80 years after its adoption, the U.S. Marine Corps ordered a new run of 1911s for its elite units. They called it the MEU SOC pistol, a modernized version of Browning's classic, hand-fitted by Marine armorers. Even after 7 decades, no design could match its reliability under stress. In that return to service, something deeper stirred. The 1911 had become more than a sidearm. It had become a thread through time, binding generations of soldiers, engineers, and craftsmen together in a shared language of precision and endurance. Meanwhile, in America's small towns, the spirit of craftsmanship endured. Gunsmiths who had inherited the old ways of fitting slides and polishing feed ramps continued the work, by hand, by feel, by instinct. They knew that the difference between function and failure could be measured in the width of a human hair. Their craft wasn't just mechanical, it was sacred. When asked why they still built the 1911 in an age of automation, one old machinist replied, "Because when you hold it, you can feel the hands that built it. It's not just a gun. It's history that still breathes. For every war, there is an after. A long night when silence replaces sound and memory replaces motion." The Model 1911 lived through that night in the hearts of those who remembered what it had done. In their dreams, they still carried it. The weight of steel on the hip, the click of the safety, the trust that never failed. By the dawn of the new millennium, technology had changed the shape of the battlefield. Lasers, optics, polymers, microchips, the vocabulary of war had evolved. And yet, the 1911 persisted. It was found in the holsters of special forces, in competitions, in ceremonial roles, and in private hands. It had outlived its critics. It had outlasted the men who once called it obsolete, because what they never understood was this: a weapon doesn't survive by fashion or novelty. It survives because it does what it was born to do, perfectly, endlessly, without apology. In every era, soldiers return from war and wonder if what they built, what they carried, was worth it. The 1911 cannot answer that question. It simply endures, the embodiment of a truth older than any conflict, that survival is not about progress, it's about purpose. And in the quiet of that long night, when the machines are still and the voices fade, the 1911 remains awake, silent, ready, waiting. Some weapons serve a generation, others serve a nation, and a rare few serve forever. June 15, 2003, Baghdad, Iraq. The air was thick with dust and heat. A convoy moved slowly through the ruins of a city that had seen too many empires come and go. Inside an armored Humvee, a young American sergeant checked his sidearm, a Colt 1911, rebuilt and reissued by the Marine Corps. 92 years after its birth, the same weapon was still in service. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Old Man Browning, guess you're not done yet." War, it seems, never truly ends. It changes its uniform, its geography, its reason. But the human rhythm remains the same: fear, survival, trust, loss. And somewhere, in every generation, a soldier grips the same cold steel that his grandfather once held. When the 1911 returned to the battlefield in the early 2000s, it wasn't nostalgia, it was necessity. Modern pistols had their advantages: lighter frames, larger magazines, but none could match the simple, unflinching reliability of Browning's design. For the Marines, the 1911 wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement, a reminder that strength is not in what's new, but in what's proven. Reports from Iraq and Afghanistan began to sound eerily familiar. Sand and grit that jammed modern pistols barely affected the 1911. Its heavy .45 rounds stopped attackers even through body armor and walls. Its simplicity, once called primitive, now became its greatest virtue. But with its return came reflection. In the quiet between missions, soldiers talked about the old days, the old wars, the endless cycle of conflict. One Marine wrote in his journal, "It's strange. My grandfather carried this same design in France. My father in Vietnam. Now it's me in Iraq. Maybe this gun isn't a weapon. Maybe it's a mirror." The mirror revealed more than steel and powder. It showed what America had become, a nation forever preparing, forever remembering, forever armed by the inventions of its own past. For every story of courage, there was another of regret. For every weapon that saved a life, another that took one too many. Historians began to look deeper into the files of the Ordnance Department, the test records of Springfield Armory, the personal papers of John Moses Browning. They found a man driven not by violence, but by precision. Browning once wrote, "A gun well made is not a thing of war, it is a thing of order." He believed that mastery of design was a moral act, that creating something perfectly functional was its own form of peace. Yet his creations armed the bloodiest century in human history. That paradox, genius born of necessity, necessity born of destruction, would haunt every gunsmith who followed. In the decades after its reappearance, the Model 1911 became a cultural relic, both celebrated and questioned. It appeared in films, in novels, in the hands of heroes and villains alike. Collectors called it the American Excalibur. Critics called it a beautiful contradiction. But beneath the myth was something simpler, a tool that reflected its user. In skilled hands, it protected. In careless ones, it destroyed. Like all human creations, it carried the weight of choice. Veterans spoke of that weight, the moment of decision, the pull of a trigger that could never be taken back. The pistol became a symbol of accountability, a tangible link between invention and consequence. A retired Marine interviewed in 2009 said softly, "We called it the 1911 because that's when it was born. But the truth is, it's as old as mankind. Every generation builds its own 1911, something that can't fail, something it can trust. And then we tested in the worst places imaginable." The reckoning was not only moral, it was historical. In 2011, exactly 1 century after its adoption, the U.S. military officially marked the pistol's 100th anniversary. At ceremonies across the country, veterans gathered to honor it. Some brought their own 1911s, the steel worn smooth from years of service. The speeches were brief, the tone humble, because by then everyone understood that this story was not about a gun. It was about endurance, and about the men and women who had trusted that endurance more than they trusted themselves. In a small museum at Quantico, Virginia, a single Model 1911 sits on display. Its finish is dull, its grips cracked, its slide marked by scratches from countless hands. Next to it, a plaque reads simply, "In service, 1911 present." Not retired. Oh yeah, not obsolete, just present. That word, simple, quiet, defiant, says everything. And so the reckoning comes full circle. From Browning's workshop to the trenches of France, from the beaches of the Pacific to the sands of the Middle East, the Model 1911 has stood as both weapon and witness. It has seen courage and fear, victory and loss, invention and consequence. It is not perfect, and it was never meant to be. It was meant to endure. In its endurance, it holds a mirror to us, to what we build, what we believe and what we choose to remember. When history looks back, it does not ask whether the 1911 was the best pistol. It asks what it revealed about the hands that built it and the hearts that carried it. Because reckoning is not about guilt. It is about understanding what survives when everything else has been burned away. April 24, 2021, Ogden, Utah. A small museum stood where the old Browning factory once hummed. In a glass case beneath soft light, a model 1911 rested on a velvet cloth. Children pressed their faces to the glass. Veterans stood a few steps back, hands folded, eyes still. Outside, the wind moved through the streets, the same wind that once carried the scent of oil, steel, and ambition. A century had passed, and the weapon that shaped generations had finally come home. The Model 1911 is no longer a tool of war. It has become a symbol of engineering genius, of endurance, of the moral weight that comes with invention. And yet its story is not finished. It continues in the workshops, the competitions, the hands of soldiers and collectors who refuse to let it fade. Because some designs do more than serve their time, they become part of what a nation believes about itself. In every polished slide, in every stamped serial number, lies a memory of labor and sacrifice. The machinists at Colt who worked by lamplight during wartime shortages. The inspectors at Springfield who checked each frame by hand. The soldiers who trusted it when all else failed. The 1911 carries all their fingerprints, faint but eternal. When historians speak of it now, they speak in reverent tones, not for its firepower, but for its clarity. The clarity of design that came from necessity, not excess. The clarity of purpose that outlasted changing wars and changing minds. Even modern engineers, armed with computers and alloys, find something almost spiritual in its geometry, its balance, its symmetry. Every curve and cut feels inevitable, as though the metal itself wanted to take that shape. John Moses Browning once said that simplicity is genius. If that's true, then the 1911 is his masterpiece, a machine so right that it outlived its century. But history's legacy is never only pride. The 1911 reminds us, too, of the cost of progress, the blood, the silence, the generations marked by the echo of what it made possible. For every victory it ensured, there was a loss it could not prevent. For every life it saved, there was another it took. And yet, in the strange arithmetic of war, its legacy remains one of respect, not celebration, not nostalgia, just respect for the minds that built it and for the lives that carried it. Across the world, in museums and private collections, the Model 1911 rests in glass cases and velvet-lined drawers. Some are polished to a mirror shine, others remain scarred, the bluing long gone, the edges worn by combat and time. Each one tells the same story, that even the simplest tools can shape empires, and that the hands of ordinary men can create something extraordinary. In the quiet halls of military museums, visitors lean close to the displays. They read the tags. They stare at the pistol and wonder what it must have felt like to hold history in your palm, to carry something that connected you to a century of struggle and survival. And maybe they realize, as the soldiers once did, that history isn't written only in books or treaties. It's written in things, in steel, in oil, in the tools we trust when everything else fails. In 2011, when Colt released the Centennial Edition of the 1911, it wasn't just a commercial celebration. It was a kind of farewell, a salute to a design that had transcended its era. But even as new models appeared, the M45, the Springfield TRP, the custom builds for modern operators, they all shared one truth. The DNA of Browning's mind was still alive inside them. That is the true legacy, not the weapon itself, but the idea that simplicity and reliability are timeless virtues. That in the chaos of progress, there is still value in what endures. Somewhere tonight, in a small workshop, a gunsmith runs a cloth along a slide and listens to the click of the action. In that sound, there's a century of memory, the echo of factory floors, of distant battlefields, of the quiet pride of men who built something that refused to die. The Model 1911 is not just an artifact. It is a reminder that invention is never neutral. Every creation carries both the dream of protection and the shadow of destruction. Browning's pistol became both a guardian and a ghost, and so its story endures, not because it changed the course of war, but because it showed us how the human spirit survives it. If you listen closely in an old armory or in the stillness of a museum, you might hear it. The faint metallic whisper of a slide returning home, the sigh of a spring, the heartbeat of a century remembering itself. Because the Model 1911 is not just a gun. It is the sound of America learning how to endure through genius, through courage, through regret. War doesn't vanish. It changes its shape and waits to be rediscovered.